Hello, everyone. My name is Esteban Garcia. I lead the Delivery and Technology Excellence team here at the Microsoft Business Group at Cognizant. Thank you for joining us for a great debate on whether multi-cloud is a destination or a distraction. I'm here with Dan Scarf, our Chief Solution Officer for the Cognizant Microsoft Business Group, and Deepak Rachandani, Director of Strategy and Transformation at Contino. Both the Microsoft Business Group and Contino work with customers, helping them move to the cloud and modernize. We'll be discussing multi-cloud in the context of IaaS, PaaS, serverless, containers, and those spaces today. We're going to start with some opening words from Dan and Deepak. Then we're going to keep an eye on your questions. So please submit your questions in the chat, and I'm going to feed them to both Dan and Deepak. At the end, we're going to share a survey with you so you can tell us what you think. Is it a destination or a distraction? So with that, I'm going to turn the mic over to Dan to get us started.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, good evening, everyone. As Esteban mentioned, I'm Dan Scarf. I'm the Chief Solutions Officer for the Cognizant Microsoft Business Group, and I am here today to talk to you about aeroplanes. Now, before you reach for the mouse, don't worry, you are in the right session. I will try and bring this back to cloud for you. But people ask me the whole time, what is the crack with this whole multi-cloud thing? And it's quite a difficult thing to actually explain to people. So quite often I use the analogy of airplanes and airlines. Now, if we look back at your historic traditional airlines, you look at International Airlines Group, you look at KLM, one of the things that's particularly interesting is that all of those airlines exhibit one key function. They are all mixed cabin airlines. They will all use a combination of Airbus Airlines and Boeing Airlines. One of the things that is interesting about a lot of these up and coming airlines, though, the Challenger Airlines, you look at the likes of EasyJet, Ryanair, Southwestern, all of these new airlines. One thing that you'll also notice, which is interesting about them, is that they don't have mixed fleets. In fact, each and every one of those airlines has picked just one provider. And EasyJet, in this example, very often gives the reason of their success as their Airbus A320 platform. Actually, that was one of the key reasons why a lot of these Challenger airlines were so successful, was because they chose one aircraft manufacturer, or in the case of cloud, one hyperscaler. So why is that something that is important? Well, there's a whole range of different reasons why it makes sense to make that commitment to one single platform. In the case of airlines, just click the mouse. It's one set of parts. When I'm running multiple different aircraft from multiple different manufacturers, I of course need spare parts for each and every one of those single aircraft. Whereas instead, when I make a commitment to one single platform, I can just keep one set of parts for all of those different aircraft. We hit the button for the next one. One training path. This is super important. Learning how to fly a jet, quite a complicated thing. Difficult enough to learn to fly one jet, never mind two jets. And this is not something that is a one-off exercise. Every year, every month, there's new safety features, there's new additional training that has to be done. And so if we're running a mixed fleet, I've now got to train each and every one of my pilots on each and every one of those aircraft. Or again, if I'm picking one aircraft manufacturer, that's just one set of training. Hit the next one. Simple stuff like one seat map. If I'm running a mixed fleet and I want to swap out different aircraft, I've got different seating maps. I'm going to have to kick people off flights if I move from one aircraft to a smaller aircraft. If I'm wanting one consistent set of equipment, I can move people backwards and forwards between those aircraft far more simply. And the final piece, of course, is commercial buying power. A lot of people say, well, actually, if you put all of your eggs into one basket, if I just work with one aircraft manufacturer, actually, I'm now stopping my ability to be able to reach good commercial terms with that aircraft manufacturer. Actually, quite the opposite is true. If I'm working with multiple different aircraft manufacturers, then my buying power is divided between each of those manufacturers. Whereas actually, if I'm making a commitment to one aircraft manufacturer, then I've got the greatest buying power with that. And actually, that's going to be what enables me to make the greatest savings. Now, you might be asking why I'm talking about aircraft. Well, because the exact same thing applies to IT. In the same way that we have three dominant hyperscalers, we have three dominant aircraft manufacturers. And actually, for the reasons that we've just given, we actually think that that focus and that specialization on one platform will actually give you the greatest advantage. However, we realized that every organization will make some use of other clouds. So instead of this multi-cloud vision, we instead encourage our customers to look at the notion of a general purpose cloud and specialized cloud. Put most of your investment into your general purpose cloud, and if you need to make use of other clouds, that's fine, but treat them as specialized workloads rather than trying to deliver all of the services that each of the clouds provide. So moving forwards, if we take this theory that we can make a bet with one of these cloud platforms, then that starts to unlock some really quite interesting things. So this good-looking chap is a guy called Russell Ackloff. And one of the things that Russell came up with was something called systems theory. If systems theory is something that is of interest to you, highly encourage you to look at that link and watch the video of Russell talking through this. But one of the most important points that he makes is that the performance of a system doesn't depend on how the parts perform taken separately. It depends on how they perform together. And this is really quite an important part as we then start to look at the next evolution of this, this question. And one of the examples that is given as part of that talk is assembling a car. And Russell outlines a situation where there's a group of engineers that get put into this enormous garage full of all of these different cars. And the engineers are instructed to create the greatest car the world had ever seen. You might take the engine from the Ferrari, you might take the chassis from the Tesla, you might take the suspension from the Mercedes. You put all of these things together and you create, in theory, the greatest car the world has ever seen. Although, of course, that's not the greatest car that you create, because whilst all of these pieces are great in their own right, they are designed to work with other components from that manufacturer. So actually, his argument is that it is far better to focus on how all of these different pieces interconnect than rather selecting the very best piece. And if we move to the next slide, we often see customers falling victim to this with this best of breed type approach. Let's create an RFP, let's pick the best solution for each particular thing. And all you do, unfortunately, is end up with the Christmas tree approach to IT service management, where you have one of everything. So instead, we encourage our customers to take a platform native approach. If we are going to go with that one dominant hyperscaler, then let's use all of the capabilities out of the box from that particular cloud, because that's going to give you the fastest path to value and deliver the greatest success for your business. So with that, hopefully I've done such a brilliant job of convincing you that multi-cloud is a distraction, not a destination. You don't even need to listen to Deepak. You just need to click on that link, click on the distraction, and our work here is done. But I'm sure you're probably going to want to hear the counter argument. So with that, I shall hand over to my esteemed colleague, Deepak.
Cheers, thank you, Dan. That was a good first round. Good effort. Let's see how long that actually lasts. I mean, let's just break it down to facts, right? And I'll try and look intelligent and take my glasses off. But in reality, 93% of enterprises have a multi-cloud strategy. So if we just break it down sheerly down to numbers, this is not even a debate. It's basically a given answer to you, right? We're at a Microsoft conference, so we have to go back to the Microsoft numbers. Microsoft themselves have 3 clouds. Am I being multi-cloud by continuing all 3 Microsoft cloud? Who knows? But the one thing I would say, often the one element that's always mistaken in the industry is the notion of multi-cloud, which in itself was created a couple of years ago, probably around the 2012 period, where you had a lot of cloud brokers trying to tell you how you should create services on the individual cloud platforms using an abstraction layer. In reality, that's a misconceived notion. The approach for success is polycloud, where you do have the ability to use the cloud provider that gives you the best bang for your buck. And again, funnily enough, Microsoft themselves have at least more than 20 services that are meant to support multi-cloud as an architecture. So clearly there is some legs in there. The one last bit I would say, you started off with an EasyJet and ended up with Tesla. So you started up with the cheapest argument and ended up with the most expensive one. I think there's a bit of confusion there. Need to figure out where you're trying to get to it. That being said, if we move on to the next slide, please, Esteban. What I would say is, let's start to bust some of the myths, right? Because what multi-cloud is not, is architecting to the lowest common denominator, and safe to say that's one thing Dan and myself, we definitely see eye to eye on. It's certainly not something that helps you avoid vendor lock-in or achieve portability. It's certainly not a disaster recovery strategy. Neither should you be looking to drive that by your cloud brokers. But what you should be doing is looking at what is the best tool for the job, looking at the engineering maturity that you have within your organization, because the reality is you start off with one cloud, you build the engineering maturity, you look at your use cases, and you look to scale out. And so really, it's a question of when, as opposed to why. As an organization, you probably are using SaaS services. That is cloud. The fact that you're not building your own infrastructure doesn't mean you're not consuming cloud. So you could be consuming Salesforce. You could be using that in conjunction with Office 365. You could be consuming that in conjunction with Adobe. Guess what? You are a multi-cloud institution. You have to take into account your data classification. You have to take into account your approach to identity and RBAC, etc., etc., etc. So the fact that we're just going to be consuming one cloud simply isn't true. And the one thing I would say, if we had to look at one of the greatest racing cars produced before Mercedes, Red Bull Racing, guess what? They didn't make their own engine, and guess what? They had a phenomenal car that won 3 years straight in a row. So again, argument proven, right? So Esteban, if we move on to the next slide, please. Going back to what does that actually mean to you as an institution? The one thing I would say is multi-cloud is not something that you solve with tooling. It is not a tooling problem. It is what is the engineering maturity that you have within your organization in order to be catered for something like this. So the one thing I would agree with Dan on, you start off with one cloud provider, you build up your engineering maturity, you build up your processes, you build in that engineering muscle in-house before you actually look to scale onto what might be your next potential destination. And with that slide, if you wouldn't mind moving on, Esteban. So when does multi-cloud actually make sense? Because there is one thing to bear in mind, multi-cloud is not for everyone. Given the fact that we work with some of the world's most largest heavily regulated enterprises, this is something that we see come up time and time again. And I've been bored to death with discussions with the regulators now. So we know this definitely works, which is, it has to be driven by a talent. If you haven't got the people in-house to do it, there's no point in you scaling out because you'll be shooting yourself in the foot. Of course, you have to make sure that you're doing it to adhere to your regulatory concerns that you might have. So if you're in financial services, the likes of the FCA, the PRA, and the EBA should be the ones you should be concerned about, and then within the UK and Europe. But also, if you do have affinity to key services that don't exist within the cloud service provider that you're using, in that case, multi-cloud does certainly make sense because there's actually customer experience and employee experience at stake here. So it's not a technical debate, it's a debate around what does it make sense for your people and for your customers. But also, given the enterprises that we work with, they usually acquire a lot of organizations. Heck, Microsoft themselves acquire organizations that were running their own services that weren't being run on Azure. So there are times when it does make sense to keep that talent, to keep that workload, to keep that service where it currently stands, as opposed to wanting to move it to yet another CSP because guess what, our corporate strategy tells you that you have to use one cloud. And last but not the least, regional availability up until a couple of years ago was a challenge, and now we are at a position where Microsoft Azure is fairly prevalent across the globe. But again, there would be times where you don't have your CSP in the region that you need it to be, and that's where, again, multi-cloud does make sense. So it has to be a pragmatic discussion on what's the actual use case behind multi-cloud. Now, if you wouldn't move on to the last slide, please, Esteban. What I would say is you have to make sure your approach to multi-cloud is correct. So first and foremost, and I completely agree with Dan on this one, is get one cloud right first. There's no point trying to scramble around the organizations, not having the right processes, the right developer experience, the right controls in place, and trying to do 2 clouds or 3 clouds at the same time, because that is absolutely ludicrous, right? But then most importantly, think about your why. So based on some of the reasons that I just shared, make sure you're considering that when you're scaling your consumption of other CSPs. Make sure you are measuring your engineering maturity. And last but not the least, right? One thing to always have into account is how well are your engineering patterns and standards in order for you to be actually consume across multi-cloud. So say, for example, if you're trying to run something like Kubernetes across various different CSPs, how do you make sure you have a GitOps-based approach where you have the right policies being applied to all those environments where you're not necessarily adhering to just one pattern, but rather a loosely coupled pattern that actually works well across all the other CSPs as well. So my last closing comment would be cloud in general is never a destination. It's just part of your experience value chain. So I would definitely bear that in mind. And with that being said, that was my closing argument. So If you think what I've told you gives you a good enough justification of multi-cloud is certainly a destination, then do vote for that. And we're open for questions.
Thank you, Deepak. So there are a few questions here for you, Deepak and Dan. So let's start with you, Deepak, since you were still you were just talking. So do you think that a multi-cloud strategy helps in keeping major cloud service providers innovate and provide the best service for the best price, in short, competitive?
Yeah, I actually cut that argument part of my session, but I would certainly say so, right? At the end of the day, monopoly within any industry stifles innovation. And the fact that you have 3 phenomenal cloud service providers doing the great work that they're doing actually really helps push the boundaries of the art of the possible of what can and can't be done. And also, to a certain degree, it helps you make sure you can push them for a lower price. So actually, from that perspective, it is great to have something like that within the industry.
Awesome.
Yeah, I'd agree to a certain extent on that one. I mean, I'm certainly not suggesting that the other clouds should shut up shop and Microsoft should take over. I mean, of course, we're going to have we need multiple clouds and they keep themselves honest. I think the fundamental question here is about a given customer. You know, should they choose multiple clouds? And again, sort of back to my point at the beginning, that this notion of, you know, using sort of trading the clouds off against each other and using them as leverage to, you know, try and knock your prices down. Typically, in our experience, it doesn't seem to work. You know, we recommend our customers, you know, instead partner with their given cloud provider and make that commitment to them. That's actually typically what we find delivers the best results. You know, if you keep this combative relationship and, oh, well, you know, I'm talking to the other guys, so you need to drop your prices, doesn't typically, in our experience, you know, drive the right behavior from the cloud providers.
There's a question from Bruno. Maybe this helps your argument, Dan. What about data collocation in regards to the position of services in the cloud? Don't services generally perform better when collocated most closely to the data?
They do, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't necessarily give that as a reason why you mustn't do multi-cloud. I mean, a lot of these cloud providers are in data centers half a mile apart from each other. So actually, you know, latency and transport between the clouds isn't necessarily a complete deal breaker, but you know, you've still got ingress and egress charges and, you know, the whole data gravity, that the closer you can keep the data to the compute, the better. So I'd say that was a slight argument towards single cloud, but not necessarily an argument against multi-cloud per se. Yeah,
and I would actually say, Dan, on that point, right, increasingly, you know, a lot of organizations, at least those with mature data approaches, are moving towards data meshes, right, as opposed to your behemoth of a data lake houses where every single piece of data would be kept. So using the argument of where do you have your services or what your development team is using, where they have their own data mesh with the right governance model, means that actually your data sets on terabytes or petabytes in this case, but rather what you kind of need with a canonical data model that can traverse across various CSPs as well, right? So that kind of helps with that model.
I think ultimately, you know, this comes down to, you know, simplicity versus complexity for us. You know, absolutely, you know, you can create all of this stuff if you want to. It just comes down to the decision about, you know, how complex do we want to make our environments. If you're a Fortune 50 or a Fortune 100 company, like, sure, make it as complicated as you like. If you're, you know, somebody else that perhaps doesn't have unlimited funds, then actually, you know, simplicity is the future here. And just because it's technically possible to create these sophisticated environments doesn't necessarily mean it's always the best idea.
So this question for both from Mike. So do you see a point where all these different clouds get to the point where they integrate really well together, or do you see that going, you know, they're all going to keep going in their different directions?
Who's that to?
Let's start with you, Dan.
Okay. So, I mean, can I see all these clouds, you know, starting to play nicely with each other? No, obviously. I mean, they're all highly competitive clouds. Can I see, you know, the clouds starting to reach into other clouds? Absolutely. You know, we talk a lot about, you know, a centralized control plane. So, you know, even if you do want to look at a multi-cloud environment, you know, make sure that you have one cloud control plane. So, you know, Microsoft's been investing a lot in this area around technology such as Azure Arc, for instance. So I can project workloads that live inside AWS into Azure and manage them as if they were in Azure. Amazon have been doing investment in that space. Google have obviously been doing investment in that space. So I think that's what's going to happen. You're going to see the cloud starting to offer that consistent management pane across other clouds, but I can't see Microsoft and Amazon becoming best friends anytime soon.
Yeah, I mean, on that note, one thing I would say, I mean, comparing it across all the CSPs, I'd certainly say Microsoft's definitely been the one that's made the most amount of investments when it comes to multi-cloud based integration, right? And that doesn't go because we're on a Microsoft conference right now. But if you were to look at a combination of Azure DevOps, GitHub, Azure AD, Microsoft Cost Manager, Azure Sentinel, right? I think despite them having the Azure ban against them, they actually perform quite well when it comes to having a set of operational tools across CSPs. In reality, it kind of makes no sense for any of the CSPs to actually play together, right? Because I guess that's where Dan's point on, they actually do have to use the EasyJet model for themselves to get the lowest price possible for you as a customer. But whether that makes sense for you as a customer to then build your patterns and services on, depends on what is it that you're trying to do and the level of complexity that you're trying to build in, right?
That makes sense. Deepak, you mentioned that you shouldn't create an abstraction layer at the lowest common denominator. That was one of the things that you mentioned. So can you elaborate on a bit on where you seek common models and where you mandate platform native? And that's a question from John.
Yeah, so I think that's a really good question, and there's a variety of components to that. So usually when we advocate a build out of your cloud adoption model as part of your CAF readiness, we sort of advocate actually breaking internal consumer down into 3 consumers. That's kind of a known notion in the DevOps world, which is where you break them down into your mode 1 settlers, into your mode 2 town planners, and your mode 3 pioneers. And each one of these consumer types have a varying degree of maturity. So what we recommend is for your mode 3 consumers, just give them the environment, right? Just give them an Azure subscription, let them do what they need to do. There's no need to give them a prescriptive approach of what they need to consume. But for your mode 2 and your mode 1 ones who do want something a bit more prescriptive, that's where you can start to put in some of these common models in place. So for example, one of the most common ones we look at is how to use Terraform as your core infrastructure as code deployment pattern. And you can put in place your approach to Terraform testing, how you're going to do BDD tests, how will you use something like HashiCorp Sentinel to have controls in place when you're looking to scale the consumption of Terraform. Equally, you can look to put in place patterns like some common operational tooling that, again, say from a cost management perspective, would be something that you use commonly across all 3 CSPs. If you're using something like HashiCorp Vault for key management, you can have 3 different instances of Vault across all 3 CSPs, but then you can have one GitHub repository from where all those policies are actually being applied. So you've got this centralized and decentralized approach going on. And a very common one, again, would be, for example, you want to consume Kubernetes. You can have Kubernetes running across all 3 of the CSPs using their native Kubernetes services, but then you can have a deployment pattern like using something like Flux or Argo CD, controlling from a central repository what your OPA policies for controlling Kubernetes compliance is going to look like. So it's a centralized yet decentralized pattern. And depending on what you're trying to do, you can make sure that you're using the best of breed that you get with native services, but also having some common models that allow you to replicate that across the actual CSPs.
Yeah, I mean, I'd add, I mean, these abstraction patterns are often, lauded as the solution to multi-cloud. I mean, Kubernetes in particular is like, oh, brilliant, we can do multi-cloud just because we're using Kubernetes. And again, the guidance that we give to customers is, don't pick Kubernetes just because you think it's going to be able to help you move your workloads around in kind of near real time, because it doesn't work. And also taking Kubernetes as the answer to all questions, again, doesn't necessarily work. It doesn't take advantage of a lot of the other native services which are built into Amazon and Azure and Google Cloud Platform. So yes, it's kind of a bit interesting, Kubernetes, and if there's a specific kind of microservices based highly scalable application architecture that you want to build, absolutely, Kubernetes is the answer for you. But it's certainly not a panacea. It certainly doesn't magically make multi-cloud work, and it certainly isn't the answer to every question. Using some of the other native services like Lambda, like functions, actually could be a much better and quicker path to value for you than sort of investing in that Kubernetes infrastructure.
So we have we still have a few more minutes, so there's going to be a few more questions, but I just want to remind everyone to start. If you've started to make up your mind on whether destination or distraction, to start voting. So I'll start throwing some questions, a few more questions before we get to the end. But you know, I think that both Dan and Deepak are making some very compelling arguments here. So you're starting to sway one way or the other. Let us know how you feel. Dan, isn't the reason that so many companies get to this point where they have a multi-cloud is their lack of a consistent strategy across business units? Shouldn't the primary goal be as complex as necessary plus as simple as possible? And that's a question from Gregory. What do you think about that?
We see that all the time, and to be honest, that's one of the primary driving factors of multi-cloud. Is you have different business groups that are autonomous to a certain extent, and a lot of this is religion, right? I mean, people love Microsoft, they hate Microsoft, and so have certain teams that say no, we want to use AWS, and certain teams no, we want to use Azure or something else. And I mean, yes, okay. I mean, you do want to give people some freedom in around this, but also. Again, you go back to the very first slide that I showed, that's now multiple training programs that we've got to run. We've not now got the ability to move technical staff around between those business groups because they're all on different clouds with, different skill sets. So, yeah. It's a very common scenario, and that's typically how a lot of these organisations get into it. But increasingly, more and more now, we're starting to see organisations come to us that just said, look, we can't keep supporting all of these different clouds. It's far too much engineering effort. It's far too difficult. Actually, now central IT wants to step up and say, actually, we're now going to be the aggregator, the governor, the securer of these cloud environments. And now the business groups are going to be our customers and buy these governed cloud services from us rather than buying them directly from the vendor. So that's sort of something that we've seen quite a bit in the past 6 to 12 months.
Yeah, and I'd probably add to that, Dan, and the fact that I think it's a level of maturity, right, Gregory, as opposed to who does what. So if you have an organization that's small in size, that's maybe just got 2 business units, I think from their perspective, it really doesn't make sense. But if you're an organization who's running at scale, running as a global entity with different development patterns being used in different business units, that's where the whole discussion of you have to just use one cloud because I tell you so is a very pointless discussion, right? Because in reality, as I said, regardless of the CSP that you're using, it's based on what customer experience and employee experience that you're trying to enhance, right? It's not a discussion of what IT service that you want to use, because IT for IT doesn't actually deliver any value. Whereas if you're an organization that's trying to deliver value at scale, that has business units that are asking you the ability to use a cloud provider because they think the enhanced customer experience and the value being generated for the business is worth it, in that case, shoehorning people to one CSP is certainly not an argument that we've seen win. And pretty much for every single one of the Fortune 50 and 500 companies we worked for have had at least 2 CSPs running at the same time.
Awesome. So one last question before we go to the poll, and this comes from Chad. Deepak, this goes directly to you. How do you explain Mercedes AMG's dominance of Formula One using your multi-cloud as a destination approach?
I knew that one was going to come to me, right? I mean, here's the interesting thing, and again, it's as I sort of said, they're not mutually exclusive, right? So it's not doing one cloud versus the other. It's a maturity thing, right? There are times when vertical, and it kind of also comes back to how you as a business run, right? Fundamentally, using business strategies, there are times when vertical integration makes a lot of sense, and there are times where actually acting as an aggregator of components that you're looking to buy in from your partners makes sense. So it's a combination of what's your business, what's the experience that you're trying to enhance, and do you have the capabilities to bring it all together? Because if you do, you could be equally, if not more, successful as a full stack integrator.
And I think it's interesting, again, we talk about Formula One cars, and again, Formula One teams, like their entire business is about how do we integrate the very best automotive components and how do we put that together into a car that can race around the track quicker than all the other cars. Their entire purpose in life is integrating components, and absolutely they should do that. But for everybody else, they are not in the business of creating the world's greatest supercar, and actually, to go and buy a car off the shelf from a vendor is probably a better model than trying to build your own car from a whole bunch of different components. So.
Awesome. So we have 1 minute. I just put up the poll results. I don't know if you guys are able to see them yet, but we are pretty close here. Destination, 19 of you said destination, 17 said distraction. I'm just refreshing one more time. So both of you made a great argument here. So I appreciate it, Deepak and Dan, for giving us your insights, and I appreciate everyone for joining us on this session.
Anytime. I appreciate it, folks.
Thanks very much.